10 years ago at the county fair's livestock auction, Brenda Miller, my fiancée, stood beside me as the winning bid was struck. "He's all yours," she sneered, dropping my hand and walking away. The auctioneer's gavel became the echo of her betrayal. Everyone's gaze branded my face. "Some men just can't keep a woman," her cousin whispered, then chuckled. The insistent knocking started precisely at 8:15 a.m. Dale Peterson had just settled into his worn recliner, the scent of fresh coffee filling his old family home. He was in the middle of a short story collection he'd picked up from the library, enjoying the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The knocking, sharp and uneven, sliced through the morning calm. He paused, book half open, wondering if he'd imagined it. Then it came again, louder this time, less a polite request and more a demand. He lowered the book, the leather creaking slightly as he pushed himself up. His movements were slow, deliberate, a habit formed from years of living alone in the house his grandfather built. He walked down the short hall to the front door, his gaze automatically falling to the peephole. A figure stood on his porch, silhouetted against the pale morning light. She was a woman, stooped, her clothes rumpled and hair a tangled mess. She shifted her weight, a worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder. He frowned, trying to place her, the face in the distorted lens almost unrecognizable. Then she moved slightly, and the angle caught a familiar line of her jaw, the way her shoulders hunched. "Brenda," he muttered, the name a rusty hinge in his throat. It came out as a question, laced with 10 years of suppressed hurt. He hadn't seen her in a decade, not since the county fair, not since she walked away. A thin, desperate voice answered from the other side. "Yes, Dale, it's me. Can I come in?" His hands shot out, slamming the door shut. The sound echoed in the silent house. It was a reflex, born of old pain, of an old wound that had never quite healed. He leaned against the door and his breath tight in his chest, but the silence didn't last. A soft, broken sob filtered through the wood, followed by another, deeper one. "Please, Dale, I'm begging you." Her plea, raw and guttural, carried through the sturdy door, cutting into the quiet of his home. It rang with an unsettling familiarity, a distant echo of the humiliation he had endured all those years ago. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it clung to him, a persistent hum in his ears. He gritted his teeth, his hand still on the cold doorknob. His neighbors, the Millers across the street, kept their windows open during the summer months. He imagined Mrs. Miller sipping her morning coffee, perhaps glancing idly out her kitchen window. He pulled the door open again, but only enough to block the threshold with his body. He stood there, a solid barrier, preventing her easy entry. His eyes scanned the street quickly, a quick check of the Miller's kitchen window, then back to Brenda. She looked worse up close. Her face was gaunt, lines etched deep around her eyes and mouth. Her hair, once a vibrant blonde, was now a dull, faded straw color. "What the hell do you want?" he asked, his voice low, a controlled rumble. "I told you 10 years ago, never again." The anger was there, simmering beneath the surface, a familiar heat. Brenda flinched, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She wrung her hands, the nails chipped and dirty. "Can I come inside?" she asked again, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm hungry and tired." Her gaze dropped, then flickered up to meet his, a desperate, pleading look. Dale looked at her, truly looked at her. Her shoulders slumped, her entire posture radiating exhaustion. He noticed the slight shifting of her weight, the way her legs pressed together. A sudden, undeniable understanding dawned on him. It wasn't just hunger or fatigue. He sighed, the sound escaping him like deflating air. Without a word, he stepped aside, the movement small, reluctant, a silent invitation he immediately regretted. "You know where the bathroom is," he grunted, the words heavy with reproach, leaving no doubt about the conditional nature of his hospitality. He watched as she hurried past him, her movement stiff. She dropped a tattered suitcase, a faded canvas bag, on the polished wood floor in the hallway, the thud resonating in the quiet house. Then she was gone, a ghost suddenly appearing in his carefully maintained home. He turned and walked to the kitchen, the familiar clatter of the K-cup machine a small comfort. The machine hummed, brewing his coffee, but his mind raced, a sudden chaotic swirl of the past in the unwelcome present. He poured the steaming black liquid into his mug, his grip tight on the ceramic. Brenda reappeared a few moments later, her face pale, washed clean from the trip, but still lined with exhaustion. She leaned against the doorframe, her posture still slumped. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice raspy. Her hands trembled, a slight, uncontrolled tremor, as she held them out. Dale stared at her, the mug warm in his hands. Every fiber of his being screamed to throw her out, to push her back into the street from which she came. But something held him back. It was his old decency, a stubborn, ingrained sense of what was right, warped and twisted as it had become over the years, that kept him from acting on the impulse. Dale placed a ceramic mug of black coffee on the scratched maple table in front of Brenda. The mug clinked faintly as he set it down. Her hands, resting on the tabletop, were still trembling. The skin was rough, the knuckles prominent, far from the smooth, manicured hands he remembered. He watched her for a moment, observing the slight tremor that ran through her fingers as she reached for the cup. She cupped it, drawing the warmth into her palms. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth or pleasantry. There was no room for small talk, no need for polite greetings. He wasn't interested in catching up. Brenda looked up, her eyes watery. She swallowed hard, a visible bob of her throat. I I have nowhere else to go," she finally confessed, her voice barely a whisper, thin and reedy. She wouldn't meet his gaze, instead focusing on the swirling black surface of the coffee. "I spent my last $20 on the cab to get here." Dale leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. The scent of her travel and desperation seemed to fill his kitchen, clashing with the familiar aroma of coffee and old wood. "What happened to the love of your life?" he asked, the words dripping with a cold, dull sarcasm. "Dr. Wonderful, I figured you'd be living the good life, maybe in a big house with a white picket fence, somewhere out in those fancy Wisconsin suburbs." Brenda flinched, as if he had physically struck her. She stammered, "Dr. Greg Hansen, it didn't work out." She took a quick sip of coffee, the hot liquid seemingly to steady her. "We got married, like you said. Things were good for a while. We bought a nice house, both had good jobs at the hospital. He was a respected surgeon. I was his lead nurse." She paused, her gaze drifting towards the window, as if looking at a past life. "But then about 5 years later, everything changed." The words came out choked, and fresh tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. Dale pushed away from the counter, walked to the table, and pulled out the chair opposite her. He sat down, leaning forward, his forearms resting on the table. His voice was low, insistent. "I don't understand." "What do you mean, both of you? What happened?" He wanted details, not vague pronouncements. He needed to hear the specifics of her downfall, to see the edifice she'd built crumble under its own weight. Brenda sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Greg was sued for medical malpractice. Her voice was soft, laced with a mix of shame and lingering fear. "A patient died on his operating table. A young man. The family sued and they came after everything." She took a shuddering breath. "Because I was his nurse at the time, I was included in the lawsuit. They said I didn't follow proper protocols, that I enabled his negligence." The explanation sounded rehearsed, yet her voice still cracked at the end. She continued, the words spilling out, a torrent of lost dreams and bitter realities. "We lost our jobs, both of us. The hospital fired us, of course. Then the Wisconsin Medical Board revoked our licenses. They stripped us of everything. Our house, the cars, our savings account, even our retirement funds. It all went to pay off the judgment and the legal fees. We had nothing left, Dale. We ended up taking minimum wage jobs, living in a rented room above a storefront." Her voice faded, the memory of that indignity clear on her face. A different kind of pain entered her eyes, a deeper, more personal hurt. That's when Greg changed. She clasped her hands together, intertwining her fingers tightly. "He got angry all the time. He started drinking. He'd yell at me for the smallest thing. He'd blame me for everything, for his ruined career, for our poverty." Her gaze dropped to her hands again. Then she raised it, meeting Dale's eyes for a fleeting second before looking away. "Sometimes," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "sometimes he'd hit me. He even kicked me right between my legs, Said it was my fault we didn't have kids to soften the blow of losing everything else. The words hung in the air, a raw, painful memory laid bare. Dale listened, his face impassive. He absorbed each detail, each confession of loss and degradation. He saw the tremble in her hands, the weariness in her eyes, the shame in her posture. A grim satisfaction, quiet and cold, began to bloom in his chest. It wasn't triumph, not exactly. It was more like an undeniable sense of things coming full circle, a bitter justice served, not by his hand but by life itself. The woman who had betrayed him now faced her own betrayal, far more brutal than anything she had inflicted. Dale watched Brenda cradle the coffee cup, her hands still faintly trembling. He allowed himself a small, cold grin, a private moment of grim satisfaction. "So the cheater got cheated on," he remarked, the words tasting like ash and an old familiar victory. The irony of it was a bitter medicine, but it worked. He remembered the 10th anniversary he had planned, the quiet dinner he'd reserved, the ring he'd meant to give her. She had chosen that day of all days to walk out with Greg, to make a public spectacle of his trusting heart. Karma is real. Imagine that, Dale muttered, more to himself than to her. The phrase was a balm, a cool compress on wounds he'd thought long scarred over, but which now pulsed with a quiet ache. Brenda whimpered, her face twisting. "It's not funny, Dale," she managed, her voice thick with unshed tears. She looked up, her eyes pleading, but his gaze was unyielding, fixed on her with a decade of unspoken resentment. "Nor was it funny that you and Dr. Shithhead publicly destroyed me," he retorted, his own voice rising a notch, the controlled rage beginning to build. He pushed back in his chair, leaning slightly away from her. "That kind of humiliation stays with a man. It eats at you. A broken bone heals. A broken spirit. That's a different story." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But you didn't care then, did you? You were too busy driving off in his fancy car. Laughing, I suppose." He leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though it carried an edge sharper than any shout. "Do you even realize that today is the 10th anniversary of that very day? The day you walked out on me at the auction?" The question was a twist of the knife, precise and deliberate. Brenda's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise mixed with fresh shame. She looked down at the tabletop, tracing an invisible pattern with her finger. "No," she replied, her voice barely audible. "No, I didn't realize." The admission was quiet, chastened. Dale watched her, a strange mixture of emotions stirring within him. Part of him wanted to relish this moment, to soak in every drop of her discomfort. Another part, a small, almost forgotten flicker of the man he once was, asked a different question. "When he started hitting you," he began, his tone still hard but with a subtle shift, "did you ever report him to the police?" She shook her head slowly, still not meeting his gaze. "No," she whispered. "I was too scared. He threatened me, said he'd make where I'd never work in any field again, that he'd ruin me completely if I said anything. And I had nothing left to lose, Dale, except my life. But I did eventually get away from him." She took a deep, shaky breath. "I found a pro bono lawyer, a woman who specialized in domestic cases. She helped me get a divorce." Brenda pushed the coffee cup away, rubbing her temples. "But I had almost nothing left after the divorce. He made sure of that. What little property we had left, what little money, he got most of it. I had to leave Wisconsin. I heard there were some jobs out here, cleaning, waitressing, anything. I took a bus, then the cab. I just wanted to get away from everything." Her voice broke, and she finally met his eyes, raw and vulnerable. "I haven't eaten anything in 2 days, Dale. I truly have nowhere else to go." His face remained a stone mask. He observed her, taking in her pallor, the hollows beneath her eyes, the desperate plea in their depths. The quiet desperation in her voice resonated in the room. "So what do you want from me?" Dale demanded, his voice hard as granite, cutting through the thin air. He wasn't going to make this easy for her. He scoffed, a short, humorless sound. "Sympathy? You won't find that here, Brenda. Sympathy, for me, exists somewhere between shit and syphilis." He watched her reaction, the way her shoulders slumped further. "I know you probably hate me," Brenda began, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, tracing clean paths through the grime on her face. Her voice was thin, choked with emotion. But Dale cut her off, his hand raising slightly, a silent command to stop. "Yes, I do hate you," Dale snarled, the words a raw, visceral sound that echoed the depths of his past love for her. The hatred was a mirror image of that old affection, equally intense, equally consuming. "You used me, Brenda. You used me as a meal ticket, as a comfortable place to land, until the great guy came back into town. You were waiting for him, weren't you? All those years, pretending to love me, pretending to want a life with me, all while hoping he'd sweep you off your feet again." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "And now that your life has fallen apart, now that you're nothing but a broken down husk, you dare to come crawling back to me?" Brenda flinched, her shoulders hunching further. "My parents won't talk to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My friends, everyone, they all disown me. I truly have nowhere, no one." Her tears flowed freely now, unchecked, making streaks down her grimy cheeks. Dale scoffed, a dry, bitter sound. "I wonder why," he mocked, his tone dripping with scorn, his gaze hard and unyielding. The idea of her seeking sympathy from him, after all she had done, was almost laughable. He paused, a new thought occurring to him. "Did you and Greg have kids?" The question was abrupt, jarring. He imagined them, a perfect little family, a painful image he'd buried deep. Brenda shook her head, a fresh wave of grief washing over her face. "No," she murmured. "Greg was infertile. He found out a few years after we were married." She looked away, her eyes fixed on some distant point. He blamed me for it. Said it was my fault, that I must have done something in my past to make him infertile. He said I was barren, cursed." Her voice broke, the memory clearly still raw. Dale absorbed this, a flicker of something dark and cold passing through him. "At least humanity won't have to worry about you two polluting the gene pool," he muttered, unrepentant, letting the cruel words hang in the air. He saw her reel back as if struck. "What happened to you, Dale?" Brenda asked, her voice small, bewildered. "You used to be so sweet, so kind. You were the only one who ever truly cared about me." Dale's anger, which had been simmering beneath the surface, now flared, a sudden hot burst. He slammed his hand flat on the table, making the coffee cups jump. "You want to know what happened to me?" he roared, the sound echoing off the kitchen walls. "Look in the mirror, Brenda. You happened to me. You took the sweet, kind man you claimed to remember, and you tore him apart. You broke him into 1,000 pieces, and then you stomped on them for good measure." He gestured around the quiet, solitary house. "You destroyed my ability to love, to trust anyone. You made me a recluse. I used to go out, had friends, believed in something. Now I just stay here, alone, wondering what I ever did to deserve that kind of betrayal." He leaned across the table, his face inches from hers, his voice a low growl. "The good guy finished last, Brenda. Remember that. The good guy finished last. And he spent a decade in this goddamn house, alone because of you." Brenda stared at him, tears still streaming, a look of genuine bewilderment on her face. But, but I thought you'd find someone else," she stammered, "and move on. I thought you'd be happy." "Are you kidding me, Wish?" Dale roared, pushing back from the table again, the chair scraping loudly across the floor. The pain, raw and exposed, was evident in his voice. "After what you've done, after you took 13 years of my life, 10 of them as your husband, and turned them into a goddamn lie? Do you have any idea what it feels like to realize that the person you gave everything to was just using you, biding their time until the real prize came along?" His voice was hoarse, ragged with the depth of his emotional wound. 13 years, Brenda. 13 years, all based on a lie. "You really think anyone wants damaged goods?" Dale's voice was low, filled with a bitter self-loathing that Brenda had inflicted. He paced the small kitchen, his movements agitated, the sound of his heavy work boots thudding softly on the linoleum. "After you publicly humiliated me, after you made me the laughingstock of the whole damn county, every time I tried to talk to a woman, I could see it in their eyes, the whispers. That's the poor sap Brenda Miller walked out on glances. It was like I had a scarlet letter sewn onto my chest, a brand that said fool and loser. He stopped, turning to face her, his hands jammed into his pockets. I shut it all down, Brenda. Every little flicker of interest, every friendly smile. I got good at it, good at building walls, good at ignoring the need for connection, good at being numb enough that it didn't hurt anymore. He gestured vaguely around the quiet, almost sterile kitchen. This is what you did, this quiet, empty house, this solitary life. He fixed her with a hard stare, daring her to argue. So are you really surprised that after 10 years I've become a reclusive hermit licking my wounds? That I haven't moved on? Haven't started over? Haven't found someone else to be happy with? Brenda's shoulders slumped even further. Her gaze dropped to her poem, her hands twisting nervously. I guess not, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper, thick with shame. The admission was a concession, a quiet understanding of the wreckage she had caused. And now here you are, Dale pressed, his voice losing none of its edge. Standing in my kitchen, looking like you've been living under a bridge. What the hell do you want from me, Brenda? What is it you think I owe you? She looked up then, desperation clouding her eyes. I was hoping, she began, her voice cracking. I was hoping you'd let me stay for a while. Just until I can get back on my feet. I'll get a job. I promise. Her plea hung in the air, heavy and raw. Dale scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. He walked to the sink, turning on the cold water, letting it run for a moment before turning it off. There's a homeless shelter downtown, Brenda, he said, his back to her. I pay taxes for those kinds of services. They're equipped for people like you. His voice was devoid of emotion, clinical. I tried them, she interjected quickly, her voice rising in urgency. All of them. The WCA shelter, the big church downtown that usually has beds. They're full, Dale. Every last one of them. The economy's bad. There are more people than ever needing help. Her desperation was palpable now, her face etched with panic. Please, Dale, I'm begging you. I'll do anything you want me to do. I'll cook. I'll clean. I'll take care of the house. Whatever you need. At her last words, the offer of anything, Dale's jaw clenched so tight he could feel the muscles in his temples knotting. A hot, ugly surge of rage shot through him, a primal urge to lash out, to strike the woman who stood before him. He gripped the edge of the sink, digging his fingers into the cold porcelain, fighting to control the impulse. He closed his eyes for a split second, taking a deep, ragged breath. He slowly turned back to face her, his eyes blazing with a raw, visceral hatred that made her flinch. What makes you think I'd want to touch you? He hissed, his voice low and dangerous, each word laced with profound disgust. He took a step towards her, his presence suddenly menacing. You're infected, walking hazardous waste, Brenda. A decade ago, you made sure I understood that. You ruined me. You poisoned me. And now you think I would let you back into my life, into my home, into my bed? His contempt was palpable, a foul odor in the air between them. Brenda recoiled, her face crumpling, devastated by the sheer, unadulterated hatred in his eyes, in his words. She shrank back in her chair, as if trying to disappear, the force of his rejection a physical blow. Dale stood over her, his chest heaving slightly, the anger a living thing inside him. I owe you nothing, Brenda, he reiterated, his voice firm, unwavering. Your suffering is entirely of your own making. You made your bed, and now you have to lie in it. The tension in the kitchen was thick, suffocating, a decade of resentment and unhealed wounds finally unleashed, poisoning the very air. Sometimes the decisions made in a moment ripple through a lifetime, shaping futures in ways never imagined. The cost of those choices, as Dale and Brenda were learning, can be truly unforeseen. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. Brenda sank deeper into the chair, deflated, her shoulders caving inward. The raw hatred in Dale's eyes was a mirror reflecting her own shattered image, and she finally understood the depth of his loathing. It wasn't just anger, it was a profound, ingrained disgust. Dale, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Please, don't you remember? The way we used to be? You were always so kind, so sweet. You would never have left anyone out in the cold. That's not the man I knew. She reached out a trembling hand as if to touch him, but he pulled back sharply, a defensive flinch. He dismissed her plea with a harsh laugh. That sweet man you knew, Brenda, he retorted, his voice chillingly calm. He died the night you walked out on him. You killed him with your deceit. You killed him when you stood there at the auction, smiling at Greg while you told me I was all yours, knowing full well you were leaving with him. He recounted the details, his voice precise, each word a stone in the cairn of his bitterness. You looked at me like I was something you'd scraped off your shoe. You didn't care then, Brenda. You truly didn't care about the sweet man. She lowered her hand, tears welling again. I, I'm so sorry, Dale, she choked out, the apology sounding hollow even to her own ears. Dale scoffed. Sorry? His eyes narrowed. You're sorry now because you're hungry and have nowhere to go. You're sorry because your grand plan with Dr. Wonderful blew up in your face. Don't insult my intelligence, Brenda. This isn't an apology. It's an act of pure desperation. He walked over to the window, peering out at the quiet street, then turned back to her. What about your entourage? He asked, his tone mocking. All those friends who came with you to the fair, the ones who celebrated your new life with Greg? Where are they now? Did they get tired of the broken promises and the public spectacle too? Brenda shook her head, her face pale. They slowly faded away, she explained, her voice soft. When Greg lost his license, when we lost the house, when we started having to work minimum wage jobs, they stopped calling. Invitations stopped coming. They didn't want anything to do with us anymore. She traced a pattern on the table with her finger. We were an embarrassment, I guess. Not the successful couple they wanted to associate with. Dale nodded slowly, a grim understanding settling over him. Funny, isn't it? One minute you're living the high life, driving a fancy car, rubbing shoulders with important people. The next, you're begging for a place to sleep and a meal. Quite the contrast from your privileged life back then. She swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on the table. It was humiliating, Dale. Living in that tiny apartment above a laundromat, the constant smell of detergent, having to count every dollar just to make rent, wondering where the next meal was coming from. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. After being a lead nurse, after all that education and hard work, I was flipping burgers, cleaning hotel rooms. People looked at me like I was trash. I could feel their judgment. A faint flicker of pity stirred within Dale, a fleeting warmth in the cold core of his resentment. He imagined the indignity, the shame of that fall, but then a sharper memory cut through it. His own empty house, the crushing loneliness, the decade of carefully constructed solitude he'd built around himself to protect his shattered heart. The flicker died, replaced by a renewed cold resolve. He thought about the irony, her life now mirroring the emotional collapse he'd endured after she left him for Greg. Brenda shifted, her voice dropping even lower, almost inaudible. There were other things too with Greg. Worse things. Things I don't even like to think about. She looked up, a haunted look in her eyes, hinting at deeper trauma than just the physical abuse she'd mentioned earlier. Dale remained unmoved. He had seen enough. Your choices led you down that path, Brenda, he stated, his voice flat, emotionless. Not mine. You made your bed. Now you have to lie in it. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. I'm going to give you a choice. You can leave my house now, quietly, and never come back. Or I'll pick up the phone and I'll call the authorities. They can take you to that shelter you said was full, or they can put you in a cell. Either way, you're not staying here. Dale stood there, the words leave or I call hanging in the air, but his mind had drifted. He looked at Brenda, truly looked at her, and saw not the broken woman before him, but the girl he married. He saw the faint ghost of her smile, the way her hair used to catch the light. His mind, unbidden, replayed the early days of their marriage. They had been happy, hadn't they? A quiet, comfortable happiness. Weekend drives to the lake, evenings spent on the porch swing, talking about their future, about kids, about growing old together in this very house. He had trusted her completely, believed in her, poured his entire heart into their shared life. Then came the shift, subtle at first, like a slow tide receding. Brenda became distant, secretive. Late nights at the hospital, always an excuse. Emergency surgery, Dale, you know how it is. Hushed phone calls, cut short whenever he entered the room. He'd dismissed it as stress, as paranoia. He'd loved her. He'd told himself he was being foolish, until the undeniable signs began to emerge. A faint scent of unfamiliar cologne on her scarf. A cryptic text message from G she hastily deleted. A note half hidden in her purse, hinting at a shared future. Each piece of evidence, small on its own, built into an irrefutable mountain. The memory of that 10th anniversary, planned as a romantic surprise, still cut him. He'd booked the restaurant, bought the tickets to the county fair, even picked out a small diamond pendant. He'd wanted it to be special, a celebration of a decade of what he thought was love. And then, at the livestock auction, in front of half the town, in front of their friends, she had shattered it all. Her voice so cold, so detached. "I'm leaving you, Dale. For Greg. He's a better man." The words echoed even now, a cruel anthem. He remembered the stunned silence, the pity in his friend's eyes, his profound, searing embarrassment. The world had shifted on its axis that day, and he had been left standing alone, exposed. The divorce itself had been agonizing. Brenda, strangely cool and efficient, seemed determined to take what she felt was hers. Half the house, the savings, the truck. He'd gone through the motions, numb, watching his life get parceled out like property. Later, he'd moved her belongings into the garage, bagging each item, a dress, a photograph, a worn pair of shoes, each one a symbol of a broken promise, a shattered dream. He remembered the endless nights that followed, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand, trying to piece himself back together. The isolation had been a heavy blanket, suffocating him. He built walls, brick by emotional brick, higher and thicker each day. The fear of ever trusting again, of opening himself up to that kind of pain, became a constant companion. The bitterness, a slow-acting poison, had calcified his heart, turning it to stone. This quiet house, once a home, had become a refuge, a self-made prison. A small sound, a nervous cough, pulled him back. He blinked, the image of young Brenda fading, replaced by the gaunt, desperate woman before him. Brenda was looking at him with a hesitant, almost fearful expression. Is there anything else I could do, Dale?" she asked, her voice meek, as if she were testing the waters. "Beyond just cooking or cleaning, I mean. Anything at all to earn my keep?" Her eyes held a flicker of something, a desperate offering, that made his stomach churn. Dale's gaze hardened again, the memory of her betrayal still too raw, too potent, to allow any softening. The past was not just a memory, it was a living wound, pulsing beneath the surface. Dale walked away from Brenda, leaving her alone in the kitchen. He retreated to the living room, needing space, needing to breathe air not tainted by her presence. He began to pace, the worn carpet cushioning his steps. His mind was a battlefield, warring factions of conscience and deep-seated resentment clashing. The good guy his father had raised, the one who always tried to do right, was buried deep beneath a decade of hurt and bitterness. But he was still there, a faint whisper in the back of his mind. He remembered his father, a stoic man who had faced his own share of hardships. "You stand firm, son," his father had always said, "and you face the truth, no matter how hard it is. But you don't kick a man when he's down, even if he deserves it." Brenda's desperate pleas echoed in his ears, a stark counterpoint to the memory of her callousness 10 years ago. "I'll do anything you want me to do." The words felt like a fresh insult, a cheap offer of herself to a man she had once discarded. He considered the social implications. His neighbors. Mrs. Miller sipping her coffee, undoubtedly watching the unfolding drama. What would they think if he simply tossed her out? Would it reflect poorly on him, or would they understand? He'd built a reputation as a quiet, decent man, despite his solitary nature. Was offering her some minimal aid a sign of weakness, a failure to fully exorcise the ghost of his past, or a final quiet victory over her ability to wound him? Could he offer help without it being an opening for her to re-enter his life, to inflict further damage? He thought about the legacy of their relationship, What did he want his final interaction with her to signify? Vengeance or something else, something closer to the man he used to be, the man she had so thoroughly broken? He heard a faint movement from the kitchen, and then Brenda's voice, tentative. Dale, are you, are you still there? A faint hope laced her words. A second chance felt like a naive fantasy, a delusion he couldn't afford. True forgiveness, the kind that allowed him to move on fully, felt impossible. The damage was too extensive, the scars too deep. He could never trust her again, never open his heart to that kind of vulnerability. But did that mean he should condemn her to the streets? He stopped pacing, standing by the cold, unused fireplace. The decision solidified, neither fully compassionate nor completely cruel. It was a compromise, a reflection of the man he was now, scarred, guarded, but still, undeniably, a product of his Midwestern upbringing. He wasn't going to let her stay, not in his house, not in his life, but he also wasn't going to watch her completely fall apart on his doorstep. He turned and walked back into the kitchen, his expression unreadable, a decision made. Brenda looked up, her eyes wide, searching his face for any sign of softening. I'll give you enough money for a bus ticket, he stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was a final, non-negotiable offer, a line drawn in the sand. A one-way ticket, out of this town, out of my life, for good. Brenda stared at the small wad of cash on the table, then up at Dale, a flicker of surprise mixed with desperate relief on her face. A bus ticket? Anywhere? She asked, her voice hushed, as if afraid to break the fragile truce. Just not here, and not back, Dale confirmed, his gaze firm, unyielding. He watched as her hand, still trembling slightly, reached for the money. The bills were crisp, $20 notes he'd pulled from his emergency stash. He kept his expression blank, giving her nothing. This is for a ticket and maybe a meal. That's it. His tone left no room for negotiation, no space for further requests. The well was dry, her eyes welled up again, a fresh wave of tears, but this time they seemed to carry a mix of genuine relief and a renewed, profound despair. She clutched the money, pressing it to her chest as if it were a lifeline. She opened her mouth, trying to express gratitude, perhaps an apology, but the words caught in her throat. She looked at him, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of understanding, a realization that no mere words could ever suffice for what she had done, for what she had become. Dale maintained his stony demeanor, watching her closely. He needed to ensure she understood the finality of this moment. There would be no second chances, no lingering hope of reconciliation. This was the end. Be gone by morning, he said, his voice low, firm. You have got a few hours to collect yourself, and then you leave. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. She slowly rose from the chair, her movements stiff with exhaustion and perhaps a touch of resignation. She walked to the hallway, retrieved her tattered suitcase, a shading, faded canvas bag that seemed to symbolize her fallen state. She gripped the handle, her knuckles white, and then moved towards the front door. At the threshold, she paused. She turned back to Dale, her silhouette framed by the pale morning light streaming through the open door. She looked at him, her lips parting as if to say something more, to offer one last plea, one last explanation. But he just stared back, his face a mask, betraying no emotion, offering no invitation for further conversation. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unbroken. Goodbye, Dale, she whispered, her voice a ghost of her former self, thin and reedy. Then she stepped out, the door closing softly behind her, cutting off the last vestige of her presence. The latch clicked, a small, definitive sound that sealed the moment. Dale stood there for a long time listening. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet he was used to, but it felt different now. A profound emptiness settled over him, not quite victory, not quite peace. It was more like the dull ache after a wound has stopped bleeding, a sense of depletion. The battle was over, but the damage remained. He slowly walked back to the kitchen, his gaze falling on the 2 coffee cups still on the table. He picked them up, rinsing them meticulously under the tap, wiping away any trace of her visit. The act was ritualistic, a cleansing of his space, his home, making it his own once again. He polished the countertop, the faint smell of coffee grounds lingering in the air. He leaned against the counter, the silence pressing in. 10 years. 10 long years of bitterness, of solitude, of a carefully constructed life around the gaping wound she had left. He had seen her pay the price, witnessed her downfall, a cold comfort. There was a grim satisfaction in knowing that life had, in its own brutal way, delivered a form of justice, but even so, the wounds hadn't truly healed. They had just scabbed over, deep and permanent, leaving scars that would always remind him of what she had done. The man he was now was inextricably linked to the man he had been, and to the woman who had shattered him. The quiet had returned to his home, a familiar presence, but the long road of his life stretched out before him, still carrying the undeniable weight of what Brenda Miller had done.